Bavaria, May 1945. Grafenwar Sergeant John Wallace pushed open the warped wooden door of a stone farmhouse. Rifle raised, finger off the trigger. The hinges groaned. Dust swirled in the pale morning light, and then he stopped. 3 children sat motionless on the bare floor, too weak to stand, too hollow to cry. Their eyes were enormous, sunken deep into skulls barely covered by translucent skin. The youngest couldn't have been more than 4. In the corner, their mother knelt with her hands clasped together, not in surrender, but in silent, desperate prayer. Before we continue, if you're finding these untold stories of courage and humanity powerful, please hit that like button and subscribe. Let us know in the comments where you're watching from, whether you're in Berlin, New York, or somewhere in between. These forgotten moments deserve to be remembered, and your support helps keep history alive. Wallace lowered his weapon slowly. He'd fought through 11 months of combat in Normandy, the Ardennes, the Rhine crossing. He'd seen men torn apart by artillery, villages reduced to smoking craters, rivers choked with bodies. But nothing had prepared him for this. The silence in that room was louder than any bombardment. The mother's lips moved without sound. The children stared at him with eyes that held no fear, no hope, just exhausted acceptance. And in that moment, standing in the doorway between duty and humanity, Wallace realized something that would haunt him for the rest of his life. The war hadn't ended on May 8th. Not for these people. Not here. The 3rd Infantry Division rolled into Bavaria in late April 1945 as part of the final Allied push into southern Germany. They encountered sporadic resistance, die-hard SS units, terrified Wehrmacht conscripts, Hitler Youth boys clutching Panzerfausts with shaking hands. But by early May, organized German military resistance had collapsed. The guns fell silent. The surrender documents were signed. Victory in Europe was declared, and church bells rang across the Allied world. But in the villages and towns of occupied Germany, a different kind of warfare was just beginning. This one had no front lines, no enemy positions to capture, just empty streets, hollow faces, and the slow, grinding death of starvation. Grafenwar was a small village, maybe 2,000 souls before the war. Strategically insignificant. No factories, no military installations, just farmland and a nearby training ground that had been bombed repeatedly. But refugees fleeing westward from the advancing Soviet forces had swollen the population to nearly 5,000. The infrastructure buckled. Food supplies were severed. The black market charged prices only the wealthy could afford. Everyone else waited to die. By the time Wallace's unit arrived for occupation duty, the village was a graveyard where the corpses still walked. Children with distended bellies and stick-thin limbs. Elderly people too weak to leave their beds. Mothers who'd stopped producing milk, trying desperately to nurse infants who cried without tears. Wallace had been briefed on non-fraternization policies. Don't share rations. Don't get friendly, maintain professional distance. The enemy might be defeated, but they were still the enemy. But standing in that farmhouse doorway, looking at children whose ribs pressed against their skin like the bars of a cage, policy seemed abstract, irrelevant, obscene. The Muller's Heinrich, once a schoolteacher, now a POW somewhere in an American camp, had been left in Grafenwar. Anna and their children, Hans 8, Greta 6, Friedrich 4. She'd sold everything for food until nothing remained. Then she waited in the cold house, watching her children fade. Through interpreter Private Klein, Wallace asked when they'd last eaten. Anna's hands shook. 3 days ago, potato soup, the last potatoes. Hans stared with hollow, ancient eyes. Greta leaned weakly against him. Friedrich lay still on the floor. The room smelled not of decay, but of absence. No cooking, no warmth, no life. Wallace left and found Captain Morrison in the command post. "Civilian starvation," he said. "Kids who haven't eaten in days. Half the village is the same." "Their enemy, civilians," Morrison answered. "Their children. After a long pause, Morrison relented. Limited emergency rations, documented carefully. A humanitarian loophole. That afternoon, Wallace returned with a small box-canned meat, crackers, chocolate, powdered milk. Anna saw it and nearly collapsed, whispering Danka again and again. The children stared as if the food might disappear. Wallace cut pieces of Spam. Hans chewed slowly. Greta cradled hers like something sacred. Friedrich held it to his lips, remembering what eating felt like. "Tell her they need to eat small amounts frequently," Wallace said to Klein. "Too much at once will make them sick." Klein translated while Anna held Friedrich against her chest. The boy eating tiny bites of processed meat. Word spread through Grafenoir like fire. By evening, a line formed outside the command post mothers with infants, elderly, barely able to walk, a few injured men. All starving, all desperate. All German. Captain Morrison saw the 50-plus civilians and made another rule-breaking call. Rations for anyone visibly near death. Wallace and his squad date men who'd fought from Normandy to Bavaria became an overnight relief team. Moving house to house, distributing food, and preventing deaths hours away. Private Tommy Martinez found little Lissel too weak to walk and carried her to the medical station while her mother cried thanks. 3 weeks earlier, he'd been shooting German soldiers. Now, something cracked inside him. Corporal O'Connor carried an elderly couple down their stairs and fed them soup made from rations. Private Chen brought formula to a starving mother and stayed until her baby drank. The stories multiplied. 14-hour days of cleaning wounds, carrying the weak, sharing bread, not conquering, just keeping people alive. On day 3, LTKL, Benson arrived, furious. Morrison stood firm. "Sir, fed children create stability. Dead children create martyrs." Benson stared. "Convenient rationalization, Captain." "It's the truth, sir." Benson left without issuing direct orders, which Morrison interpreted as tacit approval. The relief work continued. But resistance came from within the unit itself. Sergeant Carl Davis, who'd lost his brother at Omaha Beach, confronted Wallace one evening while they inventoried remaining rations. "You're giving food to the people who started this war. I'm giving food to children who didn't start anything. Their parents voted for the regime. Their fathers served in the military. They supported everything that led to this." Wallace didn't have a good counterargument because Davis wasn't entirely wrong. Collective guilt was a complicated question, but individual starvation wasn't complicated at all. "Look," Wallace said quietly, "I can't fix the past, can't bring your brother back or undo the war, but I can give a can of Spam to a 4-year-old who's dying. So that's what I'm doing. It's not justice, it's mercy. Sometimes that's more important." Davis walked away without responding. But the next day, Wallace saw him carrying rations into a house where a family of 6 was living in 2 rooms. Davis didn't mention it. Wallace didn't ask. Some transformations happened without words. By the second week, the immediate starvation crisis had stabilized. People were eating enough to stay alive. But malnutrition had done damage that food alone couldn't fix. Children developed vitamin deficiencies, bleeding gums, night blindness, muscle weakness. The division medical officer, Captain Richard Hayes, established a clinic in the village church. He worked 18-hour days treating conditions he'd only read about in medical school: scurvy, pellagra, severe protein deficiency. One afternoon, Anna Mueller brought Friedrich back to the clinic. The boy had been eating regularly for 10 days, but wasn't improving. He remained lethargic, his skin developing a yellowish tint, his belly distending despite food intake. Hayes examined him carefully and recognized the symptoms immediately. Protein deficiency so severe it had caused edema and possible liver damage. "He needs a hospital," Hayes told Anna through Klein's translation. "A real one. I can arrange transport to the military hospital in Munich." Anna's face went white. "They'll take him from me." "No, You can go with him. We'll arrange papers, transportation, everything. But he needs treatment I can't provide here." Anna looked at her son, at the American doctor whose kindness violated everything she'd been taught about the enemy, and nodded. Friedrich and Anna left for Munich the next morning in a jeep driven by Private Martinez. Hayes wrote a detailed medical referral, attached it to Anna's temporary travel documents, included a note explaining the situation. The hospital administrators admitted Friedrich immediately and assigned Anna a cot beside his bed. Hayes never learned if Friedrich fully recovered. The chaos of post-war Germany swallowed individual stories, but he'd done what he could. That had to be enough. 2 weeks after initial relief operations began, Wallace was called to a house on the village outskirts. A woman named Elizabeth Hoffman had barricaded herself and her 5 children inside, refusing American help. Wallace approached cautiously. Through the window, he could see children sitting motionless, clearly malnourished. One girl, maybe 6 years old, lay completely still. "Frau Hoffmann," Klein called in German. "We're here to help. Your children need food and medical care." No response. "Please, let us help." The door opened to Elizabeth's hollow-faced, furious, desperate. She shouted in German until Klein translated. They were the enemy who destroyed her home, took her husband, bombed her city. She'd rather die than accept help. Wallace looked past her at the children, 4 of them, silent with starvation. "Tell her she has every right to hate us," he said. "But the children shouldn't die for it." When Klein translated, Elizabeth collapsed, sobbing as if months of fear finally broke. When she lifted her head, her voice was barely a whisper. "Help them." Inside, all 4 children were malnourished. The youngest, Anna, was near death. Wallace radioed for evacuation. Medic Tony Ricci arrived fast, wrapped Anna in blankets, started an IV, and rushed her to the clinic. Elizabeth tried to follow on foot. Wallace put her in their jeep. Anna survived just. Elizabeth stayed at her bedside for days. When she finally approached Wallace, she said, "I teach English before war. I teach Americans are cruel. I believe this. I teach lies. You save my children. I am sorry." Wallace answered only, "Your children are alive. That's what matters." In the weeks that followed, Grafenwar changed. Civilians became people with names. Soldiers learned their stories. Humanity slowly replaced hatred. One evening, she asked Wallace why he'd helped them. He thought carefully before answering through Klein. "Because you needed help and I could provide it. Doesn't seem complicated, but we are the enemy. You're a mother trying to keep her children alive. That's not the enemy. That's just human." Anna was quiet for a moment. "My husband, Heinrich. He is in American camp. Do you know how they treat prisoners?" Wallace did know. They're treated according to Geneva Conventions. Food, shelter, medical care. Same as we're treating you. He'll come home eventually." Her eyes filled with tears. "For 3 years, I think he is dead. Or that if he lives, he suffers. But you tell me he is fed, is safe. This is ... double quotes. She struggled for words. "This changes everything, I believe." Individual acts of mercy spread through Grafenwar, slowly undoing propaganda and revealing the enemy as human. In June, before the division moved to a new zone, German families and American soldiers shared a humble gathering: coffee, bread, cigarettes, chocolate. Not a celebration, but a quiet acknowledgement of what had changed between them. Anna Mueller approached Wallace with a small package wrapped in brown paper. Inside was a hand-carved wooden horse, simple but skillfully made. "Heinrich makes these before war," she said in halting English. "For children, I want you to have, or remember." Wallace took it carefully. The wood was smooth, aged, showing real craftsmanship. "I'll remember," he said. "All of you, this whole time. I won't forget." The gathering lasted until midnight. Then the soldiers returned to pack, and the civilians went home to prepare for new occupiers who might not show the same kindness. Sergeant John Wallace returned to Iowa in October 1945. He took over his family's farm, married his high school sweetheart, raised 4 children, lived what looked like a completely ordinary life. But he kept the wooden horse Anna had given him on a shelf in his study. And sometimes he'd hold it while explaining to his children what the war had really been about. It wasn't about heroism, he told them once. Wasn't about defeating evil. Those things mattered, but they weren't the point. The point was the choices you made when nobody was watching, when policy didn't give clear answers. The point was deciding that starving children were more important than regulations. Captain Morrison became a judge in Philadelphia. He made his reputation for fair sentencing, for seeing defendants as individuals rather than case numbers. Private Martinez opened a restaurant in San Antonio. On the wall, he hung a photograph of himself in uniform, holding little Lissel. When customers asked, he told them the story how carrying a starving child to safety had changed his understanding of who the enemy really was. The German families scattered across post-war Europe and America. Heinrich Müller returned from captivity in 1947, found his family alive and recovering, learned about the American soldiers who'd saved them. He spent the rest of his life teaching schoolchildren about the complexity of morality in wartime, using his family's survival as a case study in how individual choice could transcend systemic hatred. Elizabeth Hoffman immigrated to America in 1952, bringing her 5 children to start over in a country that had once been the enemy. She taught English at a high school in Michigan. Her curriculum always included a unit on propaganda and critical thinking. I believed lies, she told her students. I taught lies, and it almost cost my children their lives. The Americans who saved them weren't following orders. They were following conscience. Learn the difference. In 1985, 40 years after the war's end, a reunion was organized in Grafenwöhr. About 50 people came half American, half German, all old now, carrying decades of memory. John Wallace attended with his wife. Anna Müller came with Heinrich, both in their 80s. Private Martinez brought his grown children to meet Lissel, now a music teacher in Stuttgart. Elizabeth Hoffman crossed the Atlantic one more time to see the men who'd saved her daughter Anna, now a physician in Berlin. They gathered in the church where Captain Hayes had run his clinic. Someone had organized speeches, but the formal program dissolved as people started talking directly to each other, bypassing translators, using broken language and gestures to communicate what words couldn't capture. Anna Müller found Wallace sitting alone. She sat beside him, silent for a moment. "I want you to know what your kindness meant," she said in careful English. "Not just food. Not just life, but proof that good exists even in war. That mercy is possible even between enemies. My children grew up believing this. Our grandchildren believe this, because of you." Wallace felt tears burn behind his eyes. "I just gave you some rations. No, you gave dignity. You saw us as people when everything told you we were enemy. That is not small thing." On the final evening, someone proposed a toast. They gathered in the village square with glasses of local beer, standing where 40 years earlier they'd shared an awkward acknowledgement of transformation that hadn't had words yet. Heinrich Müller spoke first, Anna translating, to the Americans who showed mercy when mercy was not required, who saw children instead of enemies, who chose kindness when kindness was difficult. Wallace responded to the German families who survived against terrible odds, who maintained their humanity despite everything, who taught us that our enemies were just people caught in the same machinery we were. They drank. Then Morrison added, to the choices we make in the margins. When policy doesn't provide answers and we have to rely on conscience, those are the choices that matter. Elizabeth, her voice shaking. 2 second chances. 2 redemption that comes from admitting you were wrong. 2 learning that the enemy is not your enemy, just another human being trying to survive. As night fell, Wallace found himself standing with Anna and Heinrich, looking up at stars that were probably the same stars they'd seen in 1945, though everything else had changed. "Do you think it mattered?" Wallace asked. "This kindness, in the grand scheme of history, do you think it actually mattered?" Anna didn't hesitate. "It mattered to us. It mattered to every child you saved. It mattered to every family who learned that Americans were not monsters. That is enough." Feels small compared to the scale of everything else. Heinrich spoke through Anna. History is made of small moments. Big events draw attention, but small choices feeding a hungry child, showing mercy. Treating someone with dignity shape how we remember and what kind of world we build. Wallace had wondered for decades whether his actions in Grafenoir had mattered or were just temporary bandages. Standing with the people he'd saved, he saw Heinrich was right. History remembers battles and policies, but life unfolds in small, human decisions. A can of Spam given to a starving child. Medical care offered to a dying girl, the choice to see a person instead of an enemy. Those moments formed a legacy of mercy that carried forward. Today, the wooden horse sits in a Grafenoir museum. Visitors read how American soldiers fed starving German civilians, breaking policy to follow conscience. Some find the story inspiring, others unsettling. But debates about guilt and deservingness miss the point. Starvation isn't politics, it's children dying. And when children are dying, the only moral choice is to save them. The children rescued grew up, built families, rebuilt a nation. Some still carry the story, proof of what happens when mercy overrides hatred. The lesson is simple. Even in war, we can choose humanity. Everything else is an excuse to turn away, and turning away is the only unforgivable choice.